Hello, everyone, to all delegates. I'm Michael Stubbs. I am a lecturer and have worked as a planning advisor to the National Trust. I should say now I'm a National Trust volunteer. I also work for a conservation board that's very interested in landscape and the quantification of landscape, quantification of heritage against the climate crisis is something that has been very interesting. I should just say that something like, if I can show you here, something like 16 years ago, I wrote a paper on, which is on heritage and sustainability, and I've been revisiting some of those thoughts for today. So just to quickly mention and refresh that heritage is very much an identification of worth based on values, some of which are critical, cannot be changed, and some of which are tradable. And many systems, looking to the Borough Charter, the work of ICOMOS, the work of UNESCO, and the work of Historic England as well in this jurisdiction, follow on that critical tradable theme, which we may come back to because it was mentioned earlier about economics and how you trade and how you, the weight and the value you give to these factors. So sorry, I tripped one. The paper I wrote, which was on heritage sustainability, is terribly old now, but it's something that I've been able to revisit for today. I'd like you to look on the right-hand side of the screen. Don't worry about all that detailed text. That's my difficult attempt at looking at the complexities of UK planning law or planning law in the heritage sector. If you could look at the word significance, which is very much centerpiece to the system, that significance or special interest is the absolute core of the heritage system. So significance is the notion of significance has been developed to allow for the management of change to sustain cultural heritage values and to maintain values for future generations. Gilbert Scott's red telephone box, which has no use anymore. This particular one, Battersea Power Station, is a kind of touchpad for how you interpret the space around you. But significance is at the core, and we should never lose sight of that, because significant places, they're now called heritage assets, historic assets in our system. Some on the left-hand side, listed buildings, conservation areas, scheduled ancient monuments, registered parks and gardens. World heritage sites are protected in law, and some are not. They're protected in policy, the non-designated heritage assets on the right-hand side. So when I go back to my original paper, I looked at the indicators of historic sustainability. We looked at the classic environmental, social, cultural, economic, and generic, although I put them within the three pillars from the UN Brundtland definitions. But the UN has been doing work since the Quito Declaration in 2015 on the fourth pillar of just sustainability, which is very important to the debates that we're having. This has been expertly mentioned by many colleagues prior. I just wanted to make that the foundation piece to all the work that we now do. A classic view of this area would look at renewable energy. The Leavesden new build, 1600 property, grade 1 listed property in Northamptonshire in the East Midlands of England, and some wind farm operator wants to build 8, although it was actually 6 wind turbines. This is a manipulated drawing by a campaign group at the time, not the National Trust, I should say. And that's a classic example of how we might look at energy and heritage. We might look at it in terms of, this is the Oxford Covered Market and a refurbishment, conservation refurbishment of a building, of an awful lot of technology going into some very historic structures. Climate change will accelerate some of these interventions that are needed. We have to balance them, but those balances will change in the next 30 years as we move towards the 2050 targets that the UK government and the Paris Accord chime with. So here we have work by Historic England on energy efficiency. When you consider that there's been some work that suggested that if you look across European Union, some 66 million dwellings existed exist at pre-1945, of which actually about 8% of those are protected in a heritage designation. So 92% are not. But this is about energy conservation, which is hugely important. Climate change will also be about behavioural change. This is from Copenhagen, the city that desires to be the world's first carbon neutral city by 2024-25. I'd like you to look at this document, Recharging the Power of Place, looking at the door. This is Sutton House in London East 9, where I worked on a project where the National Trust in 2004 with other bodies published a book, a publication that looked at the values that underlie the heritage sector. And this caused a bit of a step change re-evaluation of things like the power of place, the power of local identity for heritage. So when we look at Sutton House, we could look at the various periods of its history, which are fascinating in themselves, 1535, 1700, 1904. But when we look at it in the sense of its community, it will have a relevance to you, subject to all sorts of different things that you bring to heritage and what you value in your local community. So in this particular project, the Breakers Yard project, the National Trust created a pocket park on the land just to the east of that elevation you were looking at on the previous slide. And this particular pocket park is all about a competition, a discussion was held with local people about this area, this piece of land, and many people remember bringing their cars there when they were serviced and MOT'd, because it was a breaker's yard that the Trust acquired next door to this very historic facade of the Grade 2 style structure that you're looking at. And they created a pocket park, and that pocket park is very much part of people identifying with their heritage through play, through the relevance, through their local environment, the distinctiveness of their local environment. And the other project that I wanted to mention today when we look at cultural significance and sustainability in heritage is the new Museum for London that the Museum of London proposed at Smithfield Market. You look on the right-hand side at the green copper-domed roof. That green copper-domed roof is building number B, which is a Grade 2 market building in a whole suite of listed buildings, although building C, the controversial planning battle, is unlisted. And there's the green copper-domed roof, bottom left, the City of London, top right. You might like to just quickly notice in the presentation that proximity. It was built in 1961, 1963 as a piece of pop art architecture, the spirit of the age of the 1960s in London, fusing architecture and engineering. And here you get these rather fantastic clerestory lunette windows, which are failing, and they are letting a lot of energy through, or energy loss. They're structurally okay, but they're not energy efficient, and they have to be replaced. So that decision is made on the specifics of the heritage merits of the building, but it sits against the wider objectives of a cultural mile that the Museum of London are very much a constituent part of, to move their entire museum collection and to display many artifacts that they had no space to display in this new space. So it serves two purposes. It serves a cultural mission, and it serves a building fabric. My colleagues have expertly mentioned this previously. Adela has mentioned the heritage indicators. I won't dwell on it, but just to say that the excellent work of Historic England on the quantification of heritage, and also on discussing matters that are hard to quantify, drives forward the debates in this sector, and that's fundamental to where we're going. So, of course, we could look at this building, the Bird's Eye Factory in Walton-on-Thames, southwest of London, about to be or may have been demolished. Listed building consent was granted for its demolition. It would be recorded as a building lost, but if it were retained, and there's a bit of long discussion as to whether it should have been retained, I understand the problems of the building has structural problems. If it would be retained and it was given economic goods, then that would allow a discussion about its value in the local economy through its heritage. So when I revisited my paper, just taking you to the right-hand side, these were the topics that I looked at: the environmental dimensions, thank you, the social and cultural dimensions, the economic and the generic dimensions. And on that, just taking the right-hand side of that page, going forward with where we're looking now in this sector, the environmental dimensions of heritage will be, should be, must be driven by Paris, by climate accords and necessary targets. The European Union target 40% minimum reduction in domestic greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. But there's a social, cultural, and just dimension to this through the work of the UN in Quito 2015, and the power place plays into that. We must factor that in. Economics, there's great work being done on this by Historic England. We've had colleagues talk about that. And the generic is about continuing to data gather. And I just thought I'd mention in finishing a bit of a takeaway, if I may. If you put into a search engine the top breadcrumb of the internet, it's a film of the work of the artist Hugh Locke at Runnymede, a National Trust landscape, southwest of London. And I think you'll find that a fascinating way of looking at the layering, because we're talking here in heritage about what you might call the tangible heritage, and there's intangible heritage, which has also been mentioned this morning by Christina, and that is something that's mentioned through this film as well, not to lose sight of that. So I think my last slide is just to thank you. A student of mine wanted me to display that. He won the award for the Lego model of Battersea Power Station, a power station, a redevelopment that generates its own power. That's another dimension of how the historic environment, this is a Great Two Star building, harnesses energy. Thank you.